Welcome back. And you may recall in our last session, we talked about balancing boundaries and bonding. We talked about those parenting issues and how your parenting does have an effect on your child's spiritual development, but also how their nature and how their niche, their peers affect that also. We're going to shift gears today, and I'm kind of at a unique place in my life to share this particular session. My wife and I just recently were blessed to celebrate our 35th wedding anniversary. I'm at a good stage to share this whole series. Our three daughters are now all grown. Our youngest is still in college, so I call myself a semi-empty nester. So we've been on the journey that some of you are on right now in terms of raising your children. Well, we discovered some other things in our research regarding your family that make a huge difference in the likelihood not only that your children would come to faith in Christ, but in the likelihood they'll be serving Christ for all of their adult lives. Now, in thinking about our marriages, I heard a pastor recently share an illustration that I thought was very telling. He talked about someone going to a spa. You can imagine going and you're pampered and you're getting a massage and people are taking care of you and you're relaxing and there's soothing music. And you go to this spa for several weeks or even several months. And then one day when you go back to the spa, you get a big surprise. You walk in and instead of massage tables, there's workout equipment. There's treadmills, there's exercise machines. And you think, I didn't come in here to sweat, I came in here to relax. You realize you're in the wrong place. So you walk out and look on the sign and you realize, no, I'm not in the wrong place, it's the same building. And you go back in and recognize, hey, there's workout equipment here. That's not what I'm here for. Well, that's kind of like marriage, quite frankly, when it starts out and you're attending to one another just totally and you're enjoying it. But what you realize as real life hits, that marriage is more like going to the gym than going to the spa. And what I mean by that, it is work. And I can tell you after 35 years, I'm still working on my marriage. If at any point I stop working on my marriage, it's going to begin to deteriorate. I cannot neglect it. I've got to continue to invest and work. And just like being a student of parenting last week, it's important that I'm being a student of marriage and investing in that relationship. Why? Because you're going to see that it makes a tremendous difference, again, in your child's spiritual journey. So how can we give our children a home field advantage? That's the title of this session, the home field advantage. You know what that is? In sports, for example, did you know when you take all sports, baseball, basketball, football, soccer, whatever it is, and you look at it on all levels, teams win more often on their home field, and they lose more often when they're on the opponent's field. Why is that? Well, obviously, on your home field, not only are you more familiar with the facilities and the environment, but people are urging you on, and more of the crowd is on your side, and they're exhorting you, and it's proven out that in any sport, players perform better when they're being encouraged. When you go on your opponent's field, fewer people are cheering for you. As a matter of fact, a majority of people are cheering against you. They're calling you names. They're calling your mama names, and it can get very discouraging. And so athletes do not perform as well when they're on the opponent's field. How is it that we can give our children a home field advantage? You see, in sports, there's no guarantee you're going to win at home, but you'll win more often playing on your home field advantage. What is the home field advantage for your child? Again, there's no guarantees, but we did discover some things in our research that give them a huge advantage in being victorious in their spiritual journey. So how can we give that advantage to them spiritually? That's what this is all about. And our research reminded us, and you see it right here in God's Word. As a matter of fact, let's go back to Ephesians today. Remember we were in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And in that text, as we're talking about our walk with Christ in chapters 4, 5, and 6, remember at the center of it is the family. And in verses 1 through 4, it talks about the relationship between children and their parents, between parents and their children, and how we've got to have that balanced approach to them with that nurture and that discipline, the bonding and the boundaries. But prior to that, in chapter 5, verse 33, now bear in mind, there were not verses when Paul wrote this, it was a letter. The verses were inserted later so we could reference things. So before he begins talking about the relationship between parents and children, he talks about the relationship between husbands and wives. Notice verse 33. He says, to sum up, and what he's summing up are verses 22 to 32, the previous 11 verses. He's summing up those thoughts. He says, to sum up, each one of you is to love his wife as himself, and the wife is to respect her husband. You remember last week when it used the words training and instruction, and that was not just coincidental. The words really mean something different. It's interesting here when it talks to husbands and wives and the way we relate to one another, it mentions to wives that you need to respect your husband, and to husbands, you need to love your wives. Well, shouldn't the opposite be true? Shouldn't husbands respect their wives? Should not wives love their husbands? Absolutely. But there is a nuance here we need to be aware of, and it gives you some clues about how to strengthen your relationship with your spouse, which will affect your child, you'll find in the research. Now, according to verse 22, when you go earlier, it tells the wife how to show respect for her husband. The wife shows respect to her husband by submitting to her husband. Wow, I just opened up a big can of worms, didn't I? The word submit. Well, this is a much misunderstood thought here. I think if I can take just a few moments, while this is not an exhaustive study on marriage, I can give you a clue that will really help you in your relationship with your spouse. I have never had to talk to my wife about submission. I've never brought up this verse to her. I've never said you need to submit, and here's why. If I am treating my wife appropriately, as the scripture says, her response will be respect. Her response will be a sense of submission, and we need, again, to understand what that submission means. But what we've got to remember is this is not a command to husbands. It's not something we're doing for them. This is a message for wives. So wives, I want you to think about this for a moment. What does it mean to submit to your husband? It is voluntary deference to his leadership. Now, in a relationship where there are two people, we've got to make decisions sometimes. And let's suppose that two of us are in favor of something and none of us oppose it. Well, it's obvious. We go with it. Well, what if the opposite's true? What if two of us oppose the decision and none are in favor of it? It's obvious. We don't move forward because there's a consensus there. This text references what happens in those times when one wants to go forward and one wants to hold steady. One wants to turn right and one wants to turn left. What do you do? Well, again, you find earlier in the text, it talks about submitting ourselves first to one another. That's always your first goal, is to come to a consensus, come to an agreement. But there are times in our relationships where we got to pull the trigger. It's time to move forward. We've got to make a decision. In this case, it says when there's that 1-1 tie, ladies, show respect to your husband and defer to him on that. Not when he is right and not because he's right. As a matter of fact, the text does not say respect your husband if he's right or when he's right or if he deserves it. There comes that break point where you've got to make a decision and you defer to him. And I'll be honest with you, your husband doesn't always deserve your respect. He will not always make the right decisions. But here's what happens. When you have this attitude towards him, you're actually exhorting him and encouraging him in the way that he responds back to you. You're feeding into that relationship. Now, I'll just tell you this about guys, and maybe I'm painting with a broad brush, but you'll find it to be true. When my wife and I go get in the car, I always get in the driver's seat. We have never discussed that. It is, I guess, just nature. I get in the driver's seat. I like to be in charge, so to speak. I don't mind if she drives sometimes. I let her drive on her own. I'll ride with her, but it's just natural for me to get in the driver's seat. You know what? She kind of defers to me on that. It's just not a big deal. And the way that she responds to me, the way that she does treat me, she does allow me in those critical times to be the decision maker. You know what? Her respect makes me just love her more. As a matter of fact, you see in that text, it talks to husbands, not about respecting their wives. It says for husbands to love their wives. Men respond to being respected. It makes them, ladies, better husbands and better dads. And notice this, the husband's challenge is uniquely different. It's to love his wife. This loving your wife how is that different than the respect? Now, certainly, wives should love their husbands. Well, with husbands, we wrestle with this more, quite frankly. And again, I'm going to paint with a broad brush. Sometimes we're more analytical about things. We wrestle sometimes with the emotional side of things. But with your wife, you have to be a little bit more intentional here. And though you may lean towards being more analytical or logical, your wife needs your emotions. She needs your heart. She needs your love. And you may think, well, I love her and she knows I love her. But you've got to be very intentional about expressing that. And when you express that, it actually helps her in her relationship with you. When you love your wife, you got to understand this is an intentional act based on verse 33 as well as verse 25. Here's what happens in verse 25. It tells us to love our wives as Christ loves the church and gave himself for her. Now, what does that mean? When Christ gave his life, it was a sacrifice. It wasn't something in terms of emotions he wanted to do. It's something he was willing to do. He sacrificed his life. He deferred to his wife, the church, so to speak, to the body of believers. That's what we do. We defer back to them. We love them. But we express it on that emotional side. What we do is this. We understand that women, again, broadly speaking, respond to expressions of kindness and affection. And when I say affection, that's not to be confused with physical intimacy, although that certainly has its place and a very prominent place also. But it's bigger than that, actually. It is that affection, and I'll give you a real quick test for you and your relationship with your wife on this regard. Do you still hold hands? Now you say, why is that important? You think about it, when you first start dating and spending time with one another, the very first expression of affection in a couple's relationship is to hold hands, and usually that goes to then hugs and kisses and on down the road, but it begins with the holding of the hand. It's an expression of comfort. It's an expression of affection. And what happens many times, you go to the spa in your marriage and you're holding hands, but when it becomes work, as time goes by, if you're not careful, you begin to distance yourself from those little subtle expressions. And it's not just that physical expression of holding the hand, but those verbal expressions. Do you frequently and often tell your wife how beautiful she is? Tell her how much you appreciate her. Tell her how much she means to you. Do you tell her tangibly, I love you? You say, I don't have to tell her, she knows it. Well, that may be true that you do love her. For her, she needs to hear that. She needs to know that you love her. And so sometimes that is a sacrifice for you. It's not what would come natural. So for the wife, when she respects and defers to her husband, it makes him have this desire to love her. And husbands, when you love your wives in this way and you express that, it gives her this respect for you and this deference that we talked about. It makes the marriage work. Now, again, this is not an exhaustive look at marriage, but just to introduce a topic and to show you a connection. But I want you to notice what these two acts have in common. The wife respecting the husband and the husband loving the wife is that they both are intentional acts. There's intentionality there. There's also a discipline there that you're purposeful about doing it. There's sacrifice there because your husband does not always deserve your respect. You may suppose that your wife is not lovable. The text does not say love your wife if she's lovable. You may say, I'm not sure if my wife loves me. It does not say love your wife if she loves you. It says do like Christ did. It was sacrificial. It was based on his determination to give and express an unconditional love. And so we began to dig into marriage here, and there's a method to my madness. And again, while I could spend an entire hour or 2 hours, and I've done marriage retreats, just kind of setting the stage, I hope that prompts you to think a little bit. But let me share with you what the research revealed and why this subject is important. Now, I want to encourage you with this. First of all, here's what we found in our research. Did you know this? I'm going to use a word that's kind of fun, but did you know that a spunky marriage gives your children home field advantage? Now, you remember what home field advantage is. You're more likely to win at home. In the spiritual context, a child is more likely to come to faith and be in church as an adult when they have home field advantage. Well, did you know that having a spunky marriage, now what is a spunky marriage? Having a passionate, enthusiastic, loving marriage, that those children are more likely to be in church as adults. The study revealed that young adults whose marriages had failed when they were growing up because it wasn't spunky, because it fell apart, they were 11.6% more likely to have strayed from church. We found that when adults grew up in homes that had healthy marriages, the other side was they were more likely to be in church. Said another way, when children grow up, or when adults grew up in a home where parents had a spunky marriage, they were more likely to be in church as adults. Did you know that your marriage is literally affecting your child's view of God? And we're going to see how that is in just a little bit, and how they might embrace God. And I want you to hear this also, that the number of children who turned out to be out of church as adults, it doubled if the marriage broke apart while they were in high school. So that's why, again, you need to really hear this and understand this, but also relax, because I'm talking to some of you right now who are in a second marriage, maybe a third, or maybe that you're a single parent now, you were married at some point. And you can relax, because there's no condemnation about to come your way. I'm not about to beat you up or get on to you, because I can appreciate, and although I've been blessed to be married 35 years, it is by the grace of God. And I have some very godly friends and family members who have had marriages that did not work, and I understand. It takes two to make a marriage work, not one, and they both have to be working towards it. And one can work as hard as they want. If the other's not going with it, it's not likely to happen, although I can appreciate that with God, certainly all things are possible. But I want you to hear that, and we're going to dig into some of what it means and how you need to respond to that, whether you're married or whether you had a marriage that didn't make it. But you need to understand what we found in the research there. It does make a difference. The second thing we discovered was this: a close relationship to both mom and dad. Now, keywords here, both, mom and dad. Give your child a home field advantage. Again, the home field advantage meaning they're more likely to be in church as adults. A study revealed that a young adult was more than 50% more likely to have strayed if they were not close to mom or if they were not close to dad. And you can imagine if they were not close to either one, the likelihood of them straying. But we found that the relationship with both parents was critical. And there's, I think, a connection between point one and point two there about the marriage and the relationship with mom and dad that we'll see as we move forward. Now, this is something I think that will help also, this third issue. And you may recall there's 15 big issues and 10 smaller ones. These are two of the smaller ones. So I want to share them with you, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's just something you need to be aware of. Third thing we found in our research in this regard about home field advantage is that the type of community that you live in and minimizing the moves to new communities can provide a small advantage to your children. So I'm going to say those again. The community you live in, or the type of community, and the number of moves that you make. Again, not moving to a new neighborhood down the street, but moving out of state or moving to a whole new school district. And here's the things we found out. Those who were in very rural or very urban areas were slightly more inclined to stray. And it was slight, but again, when you look at the urban areas inside the city, the urban-suburban, suburban, the suburban-rural, and then the rural and very rural. It was like the bell curve again. The further away they got from that suburban area, the more likely they were to have strayed, and especially when they were in the urban areas and the very rural areas. And this is not to suggest that you should move. It's not to suggest that you should not ever move, but it's something that should be taken into consideration. And I'll give you one quick interpretation of that. I think in the very rural areas, there's fewer choices for churches, and there are great churches out in the country, don't get me wrong. But again, when there's a choice of 2 or 3 churches versus 30 or 40 churches, you certainly have the advantage of finding a better church that can nurture the faith of your child. Likewise, in the cities, and you can go into the state in which I live, you go inside what we call the perimeter there, and the unchurched numbers are like 90% compared to 70% statewide. So there is a factor there. So it's just a consideration. But also, children who experience multiple moves growing up were more or slightly more inclined to have strayed. Ironically, if they moved a whole lot, it didn't seem to matter that much. For example, a child who grew up in a military family who moved 17 times, that didn't seem to matter. But if they moved 2 or 3 or 4 times, they were slightly more inclined to stray. Again, that doesn't mean you should never move. Sometimes you're compelled to. It just means you need to take this consideration if there are options. And you would note also, as your child is in adolescence, it seems to have a bigger factor. But again, this was a milder issue. But again, the point is not you should never move. It's that you need to weigh all the implications. Well, let's talk about some application. What does this mean about the marriage and this relationship between mom and dad? Those are the bigger issues I want you to really give the weightiest consideration. Here's some thoughts for parents. First of all, children who have stability in their home life, especially during adolescence, are more inclined to stay in church. Now think about this for a second. I mean, it's rough being a teenager. It's rough being in middle school. And you're dealing with peers, and it's a dog-eat-dog world, and your world may be falling apart as a child, or as a teenager you didn't make the team, or you don't like your appearance, or your boyfriend or your girlfriend broke up with you, and so life's falling apart, and in the community it's rough, there's a lot of pressures. And even at church things may not be going well. But imagine a child who comes home and it's a safe harbor, and there's peace, and there's parents who love them unconditionally. And there's not necessarily an absence of conflict, but there's an understanding, even in the midst of conflict, it's handled in a Christ-like way. And there's no fear that it's going to fall apart, but it's going to be worked through. So conflict's not a bad thing as long as mom and dad are respecting and loving one another, as long as they're coming to agreement, as long as they're loving one another unconditionally. And so that home field advantage is when they have that environment. They're not coming home to cursing and dad, calling mom every name in the book, and just huge blow-ups and arguments and squealing tires and slamming doors and threats of divorce. That's not what's happening in their home. No, it's a calm atmosphere. Again, not the absence of conflict, but a very measured, and it's not something going on day in and day out. As a matter of fact, in our home, we had conflict, but the conflict was the exception, not the rule. It wasn't day in and day out. And our girls will tell you it's just something they didn't experience a whole lot of. And even when my wife and I had those things, sometimes we made sure that we were expressing those things privately instead of in front of our children. We wanted our home and our house to be a safe harbor for them and to give them, again, that stability. You got to hear this. A healthy marriage is not built on the absence of conflict. So don't hear that. There's conflict in every marriage. If you're with somebody long enough, you have conflict. The difference is, in a healthy home, your marriage is built on skills to co-manage and resolve the conflict. And I use two important words there, co-managing the conflict. In other words, for my wife and I, when we do have a conflict, I've got to understand she's not my problem. And she's got to understand I'm not her problem. So we're not to fight against one another. We're to fight together against the problem. And that's the key. So many times, couples, because of what was modeled in their home, or because of bad habits, or because they're not immersed in the Word of God and they tend to act within the flesh, they have a conflict and they're subject to attack one another. And then what's happening there is you're undermining that love that you have for one another. Instead of investing in that love and respect, instead of investing in that relationship, you're draining and you're pulling out of it. And it's so important that you're doing more investing in that than that you're draining from it. So conflict can actually be a way to invest when, instead of attacking your partner, you're identifying together what the problem is, and then together you're attacking the problem. That's what I mean by co-managing. You're working towards a resolution. And you've also got this attitude that we may argue, we may debate, and we may fight, but I will not stop loving you. I love you unconditionally. We're going to make our way through this. We'll pull in other resources if we can't do it on our own. And when you co-resolve conflict, and when you resolve conflict, well, yeah, you have it, but it comes and it goes. And when you have that love investment, that respect investment with your spouse, it's minimal instead of maximum. And it gives your child that very important environment. So let me summarize those things again. You've got that healthy marriage relationship, and you've got a relationship that is good with mom and with dad. And when you combine those things together, there's certainly no doubt there's a greater likelihood that child's going to be in church. So we need to attend to both of those things. Now, you may recall there was a lesser issue. I'm just going to touch on it briefly regarding the community that you live in and the way it might affect your child's faith. Remember, it was a smaller issue. It was bigger than the margin of error. And the number of moves that you make. Regarding that point, while it should not determine what your family decides, it should be weighted into your decision-making process. So it just needs to be given consideration. It probably doesn't need to drive what you do. It just needs to be a consideration. But let's go back to these other issues. Which comes first in your marriage? The needs of your spouse or the needs of your children? Because we're talking about parenting. And I find a lot of times one reason that marriages struggle sometimes is we invest so much in our children, we neglect our relationship to one another. God forbid that you were on a plane that was about to go down, that they give you instructions. You remember how they tell you during the orientation that should the cabin lose pressure, an oxygen mask will drop down in front of you. And then they tell you something. First, place the oxygen mask over your own face, then over others. In other words, if you have a child, you don't put the oxygen mask on them first because while you're doing that, you may pass out. No, first you put the oxygen mask on and then you put it on them. And the same is true with your marriage. You are a better and more effective parent when you give attention to your marriage. So you attend to yourself first. So understand that the needs of your spouse, scripturally and practically, actually have to come before your children. The marriage is the priority. You've got to understand that it affects, again, all of these things. Now, I want to encourage you here to remember when you fan the flames of your marriage, you're also fanning the flames of your child's faith. I want to say it very bluntly. Men, if you want to help your child spiritually, one of the greatest things you can do for their spiritual journey and spiritual nurture is to love his or her mother. And ladies, one of the best things you can do for the faith development of your child is to love their dad. But we did bring up the elephant. It is there. What about this situation where divorce has occurred? Again, no condemnation here. I want to give you some encouragement because you live life looking forward. You understand it looking backward. You don't live it looking backwards. Like driving down, you don't look in the rearview mirror. You glance at it. You're aware of what's behind you, but your focus is out the windshield. You don't need to focus on what's behind you. You need to be aware of it. In relationship to your child, if you've experienced divorce, I would say again, you need to be very comfortable and clear about what the other 14 big issues are and focus on those. And you can help your children overcome that crisis that they experienced. But again, if you can't go back, be familiar with these other issues. And there's that connection also about the relationship with both parents. So consider that. If you do have a former spouse who is the parent of one of your children, and this is awkward, you must, to the degree there's no threat of any abuse or gross moral negligence, it's going to cut against your grain. You've got to continue to nurture the relationship between your child and your former spouse. Well, it goes back to that point that a child who has a good relationship with both their mom and their dad are more likely to be in church as adults. So I want to challenge you with that. There has to be forgiveness. There's no point in continuing to fight and to fuss. I mean, it's already done. You're moving forward from here. So I want to encourage you to do that. Also, there may be somebody listening to this right now, and your marriage is going through difficulty, and perhaps you're contemplating divorce. I've actually seen one marriage tangibly saved through what I was sharing here, as a lady that was hearing this information had an attorney she was meeting with 2 days later, and when she heard this, she realized that she may be causing some sabotage to the faith of her children. That wasn't her intent. That was a consequence. And so she put the brakes on it and actually had when I say a come to Jesus meeting with her husband, I mean a very positive conversation where she and her husband determined to turn it around at whatever cost that would take. And appreciating and understanding, the longer it takes you to get into a bad situation, the longer it's going to take you to get out. But the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a step. And her first step was to cancel that appointment with that attorney and have this discussion that, for our children's spiritual growth, let's look at this again. But it's not just a matter of hanging in there and staying together for the children. No, it's a matter of beginning to reinvest and to rekindle that relationship. And you may think it can't happen, but let me tell you, marriages have come back from very desperate situations, from infidelity to actually where their marriage has already been dissolved. You see, because if we believe all the Scripture, as it says in the Scripture, some things may seem impossible, but with God, all things are possible. So do you really believe that? Now, it's going to take work, and probably more work than you've ever had. And it's going to take some guidance and perhaps some intervention from somebody professionally, getting the counsel and the guidance you need. But I want to consider the consequences to your child before you would move forward with such a decision. But again, I say that to encourage you. Now, I want to do this in closing just to remind you, a relationship to both mom and dad is important. So reflect back to last week, the nurture and the admonition. No matter what the circumstances, you can't neglect either, the boundaries and the bonding. Well, I'm not talking about your spouse, I'm talking to you. Are you spending time with your children? Are you having fun with your children? Whether they're 2 years old or 17 years of age, are you having fun? When's the last time you had fun with your kids? You want to maintain that good relationship with them. Are you nurturing your relationship with your children as their parent? These things are so important. You need to talk about these things. In your group, let's do that. If you're not in a group, I want you with your spouse to discuss some of these issues and reinvest in your parenting, reinvest in your marriage. And if you're a single parent or if you've gone through a divorce, I want you to have a discussion with somebody that you trust and be encouraged. God is going to work, and you wouldn't be watching this if you didn't care and if God didn't have a plan for you and for your children, and I trust that He will. But I thank you, and I'm looking forward to sharing in our next session.